Hello and welcome to Board Game Tutorials. I'm Cymrych Hughs from Blue Hand Gamers, and today we're going to learn how to play Court of the Dead, Mourner's Call. Now, Court of the Dead is made by Project Raygun, and this is a worker placement game. In Court of the Dead, Mourner's Call, players take on the role of a mourner, which is pretty much a person that works for death in the underworld. And as such, we're trying to unite the underworld factions of bone, flesh, and spirit in order to end the celestial war between heaven and hell. However, the mourners themselves have their own hidden agendas. But before we get into all that, as always, let's see a little quick setup. Alright, now that the board is set up, we move on to setting up your player board. First, you choose the color of the faction you want to play, and your color will always be in the top left. After that, you can take all color tokens associated with your faction board. Your faction will come with little standees that you can put your figures in, and these little colored discs that you can use to track your guild presence. All players will then take 3 track tokens, and you'll notice how the influence for each guild has one symbol that's different than all the others. That is the starting position for your track tokens. All players will also take 2 Etheria from the supply on the game board and place that in its appropriate area on your player board. Now, during game setup, we separated all the ulterior motives cards by faction. At this point, we will take 1 from each faction, randomly drawn, to every player. So every player should have 1 from flesh, bone, and spirit. Every player will also gain a corresponding faction token. Secretly, you read through all 3 of your faction's ulterior motives, choose one you want to keep, and then take the matching faction token and place it face down on your faction section of your player board. The other ulterior motives get removed from the game, as well as the faction tokens. You'll no longer need those. After everyone is ready, you will then reveal your faction that you have chosen. All players will reveal their chosen faction, and then in player order, you will all choose one of the starting Mourner cards. Player order is decided by the oldest player. They get the death figure, also known as the All-Taker. Now, every Mourner card shows one of the 2 different figures, because in each faction there are 2 sub-factions, 2 separate guilds. When you choose your first Mourner's card, you will also gain the figure associated with this card. If more than one player has chosen the Bone faction in player order, you would then pass this deck of starter Mourners to that player. If no one else has chosen your faction, then instead of passing those cards to the next player, you would then shuffle them into the Mourner's deck. Place the figure you have chosen from the Mourner's card into one of your colored standees and place them in the crypt. And lastly, anytime you gain influence from a specific guild in each faction, you will find the matching symbol of those figures and make sure to take claim that you have one of those members in that guild. That takes effect later during the resolution phase. Alright, I've got this game set up for a 3-player game. In a 3-player game, you will start with 30 Unity tokens. In a 2-player game, it's only 25. And in a 4-player game, it'll be 35. Now that the game board is set up, and all player boards are set up with their beginning Mourner card and guild figure, we will now go into the phases. Phase 1 is the ethereal distribution. The first player will take an equal number of 6-sided dice as the number of players in the game. In this case, we have 3, so we roll all 3. We'll total them all up, and we've got 10 altogether. What that means is we will take 10 ethereal and separate it into however many players there are, plus 1 piles. This you really get a chance to strategize, because you could make it 1 pile of 1, or 3 piles of 1 with 1 pile of as many as you can get in there. You want to make it as strategic as possible, because the first player separates the piles, however the person to their left takes the first pile. And then in turn order, we'll continue to take their own pile, and with whatever is left at the end gets added to the Dearth Forge, be later used as celestial tithe to prevent the celestials from taking suspicion as to what us mourners are doing. We have to pay them off. As a side note, if you decide to take none of the piles, you can instead gain 2 influence of any of your choice. Instead of gaining Etheria, you will gain any 2 faction influence of your choice. Phase 2 is the Wallows cards and Rakers. Rakers are these mean little guys that will go along to the different locations based on cards, and you can either fight them for bonuses or leave them be, but suffer the penalties afterwards. During the Wallows phase, every player will receive 1 Wallows card from the top of the deck, in player order. Rakers send one of the purple figures to the location on the card, where players can then move their figures to that location and fight them. If they win the battle, they gain bonuses. If they lose the battle, they suffer penalties. If no one fights the Raker, then during cleanup phase, whoever owns the Raker card will suffer the penalties listed. Event cards tell you if you perform a certain something, you gain bonus effects. If you meet the requirements on a follower card, you can gain additional guild figures without increasing the Dread's Grip threat. Celestial Scouts will give you bonus objectives that could be beneficial, but if incomplete, could suffer a penalty as well. Location cards give you bonus effects based on things you have done on the locations on the board. However, sometimes they could also incur penalties. Artifact cards give you an objective to complete in order to gain this card for the remainder of the game. If you do gain it, for every preceding round, you are now allowed to use the benefits of this card. If you do not complete the objective, the Wallows card will then be discarded during the cleanup phase. The next phase will be the court card draft phase. You'll deal court cards to all players based on the number of players. In a 2-player game, players will get 6 cards. In a 3-player game, players will get 4 cards. And in a 4-player game, players will only get 3 cards. Now in draft fashion, you will choose one of these cards to keep for yourself, and then face down, hand the remaining cards to the next player, in clockwise order. This draft will continue around the board until all players have the player required amount of cards. Next up, we have the action phase. During the action phase, every player is required to play 1 action. Sometimes you can play certain court cards or ability cards that give you a bonus action, but generally you only get 1. Now during your turn, one of your available actions is a court card. When you play a court card, you tell them whether you're taking the top or the bottom action. You will then do whatever penalties, bonuses, or abilities that court card shows. You can also take a recruit action, in which case you can spend 3 or 5 Etheria in order to gain new figures. If you spend 3 Etheria, you raise the Dread's Grip threat by 1, and you can recruit any figure from any guild. Remember, when you recruit a new figure, make sure to add your presence in that guild. That figure will then go into the crypt. The Etheria spent will go back to the game supply. Now, if you chose to spend 5 Etheria instead, the Dread's Grip threat will also increase by 1, but you get to choose your faction Mourner's cards. You'll draw 2 of them, decide which one you like the most. You will then keep that card, place the other one face down at the bottom of that deck. And just like player setup, whatever figure is shown on the bottom left of that card, you will gain that figure and place them in your crypt. Don't forget to claim your presence in that guild. Another action you can take is to relocate your figures. You can relocate from any one location to another location. So if you have multiple figures in one space, you can spend the influence on your player board that matches the guild faction. So in this case, if I want to move from this location to this location, I can spend 1 bone to move him, 1 flesh to move him, and if I wanted to spend a 2nd bone, I can move a 2nd bone faction. It also works for your crypt. You can move them back into your crypt, again spending faction influence, or out of your crypt if the crypt is the location you decided to move from. Some of the Mourner cards also give you abilities you can do. They will be listed on the card and will tell you what you can do and what your bonuses or penalties will be. Your last action you're allowed to take during your turn is pass. Once all players have passed, the action phase will end. The next phase is the Dread's Grip threat phase. At this point, you will look at where the Dread's Grip threat token is and see the large number to the side of it. This number will show you how many guild figures are allowed in every individual location. If at any time you find a location that has more than the listed number, all players who own that faction now have to roll a die. As listed on the track, if you roll a 1 or a 2, they will get removed from this location and added to your crypt. On a result of 3 to 6, nothing happens and they get to stay. So it's a gamble. If at any time the Dread's Grip threat meter reaches 10, the player who caused it to do so will lose 1 Mourner card and 1 guild figure of the type indicated on that card. The player to their left selects which card they will lose. Additionally, all other players lose 1 guild figure of that same type. The Mourner card is removed from play and the figures are returned to the supply. The Dread's Grip threat meter will then reduce itself back down to 9. After that, we have the Celestial Suspicion and Celestial Tithe. Now, in order to keep the Celestials off our backs while we perform our nefarious deeds in the underworld, we must pay them to look the other way. So throughout play, your track marker will go up. Now, this will give you a number based on how many players are in the game, plus whatever is listed. In this case, we have 3 players plus 5. We must now pay 8 Etheria to the Celestials. Whatever is on the Dearth Forge will get removed from play and get counted towards our tithe we must pay. Now, all players present must take all Etheria they have, place whatever Etheria they wish to bid blindly in one hand, and the Etheria they want to keep in the other. When all players are ready, they will put their hands out and drop what they bid. Now the payment can go one of two ways. If you met the required amount of payments, then you follow this. Whoever contributed the most from the blind bid will now gain 3 Unity tokens. All other players who did make a bid will only gain 1. If there is a tie for the most, instead of gaining 3, the tied players will gain 1 each, and no additionals will be passed out to anyone else who has participated. If the payment was not reached, instead, we will go up 2 Dread's Grip Threat and 2 Celestial Suspicion. Now during this phase, if the Celestial Suspicion hits 10, whoever bid the least amount of Etheria will then have to remove 3 Unity from their faction board. If they cannot, they then have to pay the remaining in guild faction influence of their choice. During this phase, if the Dread's Grip threat reaches 10 on this track, again, whoever bid the least will now have to discard 3 Unity, as well as lose 1 Mourner card and figure. But again, once that is resolved, it will go back down to 9. After that, we have the Resolve Location and Guild phase. Whoever has the most owned guild figures in each location gains the bonus. So in this case, the blue player will gain 3 Etheria. In location 2, you're allowed to gain 1 of any faction influence and 1 Etheria. Location 3 is any 2 guild influence, but they must be different. Number 4, any 2 guild influence, but the 2 you gain must be the same. Number 5, gain 1 Bone Faction Guild figure while increasing the threat mark by 1. Or, instead of doing that, you can gain 1 Bone Influence. 6 is the same, but for the Spirit faction, and 7 is the Flesh faction. In 8, you're allowed to gain 1 Spirit faction influence for every Spirit faction figure in this location. 9 is the same, but for Bone, and 10 is for Flesh. In number 11, you may remove any guild figure you have on the board and return it to your crypt. If you do, you reduce the Dread's Grip threat token by 1, but you also increase the Celestial Suspicion by 1. You also gain 2 Unity tokens. Number 12, if you remove one of your figures from this location back to your crypt, you'll remove 1 Dread's Grip, add 1 Celestial Suspicion, gain 1 Unity token, and gain 1 influence of your choice. After locations are resolved, we then move to the guilds. In number order, we will resolve these. Whoever has the most of each individual type of guild figure will gain the bonus listed, such as 3 Etheria, 2 guild influence of your choice, the Dread's Grip token, which we will return to in a moment, here you can remove 1 Dread's Grip threat, gain a Unity token, and an influence. This allows you to remove any influence from your faction board, and from that same influence chosen, remove any guild figure from the board. Whoever owns the removed figure will have to then adjust their guild token. And lastly, we have, you can gain 1 guild figure of any kind, but increase the Dread's Grip threat token by 1. If Malavestros is in any of the locations, instead of gaining the location's benefits, All players who have a figure there will instead just gain 1 unity each. The last, we have Cleanup Phase. If any of your abilities or cards say Cleanup Phase ability, you may resolve them now in turn order. If you had any of the 3 factions' boss figures, they must then be removed and added back to the supply. All incomplete Wallows cards will then be discarded, and if any penalties are implied, must be suffered now. Any Mourner cards whose abilities were used will then get refreshed to be used again in the next round, and all court cards will be returned to the court card deck. At this point, check to see if there are any remaining Unity tokens in the top left of the game board. If there are, we will continue another round. For endgame scoring, whoever has the highest amount of Unity tokens, as well as bonus from the faction board's influence, and score gained from their ulterior motive, will be the winner. So that's the basics of Court of the Dead. It's a pretty fast-paced worker placement game where you have to strategically start placing your people, your figures, to start taking advantage of the guild figures, or the guild's bonuses, the location bonuses, while at the same time trying to prevent your opponents from obtaining their ulterior motives, gaining that bonus power, that bonus score. It's got a lot of promise, a lot of variety, the randomness in the cards. The court cards are really fun. Overall, the art is just amazing in this game. And the fact that you get to be an underworld underling for death while trying to stop a war is just pretty cool. Overall, really enjoyed this game, and I hope you all do too. Come and join us next week to see the playthrough with Blue Hand Gamers.